Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Let me begin by welcoming everyone to this important seminar by the Department of Political Science, and I do so on behalf of our President, Dr. Johnson, and certainly on behalf of the faculty and staff and students of the university. I bring greetings to you, and it is also indeed with a great joy and delight that I welcome my brother to this university. I understand Honorable Laro assumed his responsibilities as Consul General for Nigeria this year, early part of the year. So it's a feeling really to have him spend part of his stay with us at Clark Atlanta University. I see also former Chief of Staff to the President and now Vice President for Asset and Real Estate Management, who really is very glued in global affairs and very, very delighted that she is here. Some of you may have woken up this morning and heard the news about the resignation of His Excellency Robert Mugabe. And while some may indeed express joy, it is also important to pause about the contributions of the giant to Africa's independence and Africa's liberation struggles. And it is clearly indicative of those contributions that the Zimbabwean people took time to ensure that even in the midst of saying goodbye, that they follow a constitutional order. Nigeria has played a key role in South Africa's independence struggles, South Africa to Zimbabwe. And as Ambassador Laro will share with you tonight, Africa has always been the centerpiece of Nigeria's foreign and economic policy. This university has also played a role in Africa's struggles. As you recall, those of you who may have watched, last week we were very fortunate to be one of the 10 universities in the nation selected to participate in the sharing of a major documentary put together by the Public Broadcasting Service and the Corporation for Public, PBS and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That documentary, which was is titled "Tell Them We Are Rising: The History of HBCUs," is a powerful documentary that I want to encourage all of you to watch. We have it on campus. But it does detail the role of HBCUs such as ours, not only in the liberation of people in the United States, but also in Africa. And as I mentioned during that session, that two of the foremost leaders in Africa, in Africa's independence, actually studied here. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who became president of Nigeria, was a student at Howard University and Lincoln University, and graduated from both universities and ended up working with the Baltimore Afro-American. And so the work that HBCUs have played in influencing the liberation struggles in Africa. So you see a synergy of relationship. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who also became president of Ghana, studied at Lincoln University as well. So Ambassador Laro's visit, and certainly that of two brothers here as well, reflects really that continued relationship between HBCUs as the centerpiece of our struggles for advancement in education, the economic struggles, and the freedom of our people, not just here, but also across the continent of Africa. And as we engage in those conversations tonight about Nigeria's economic struggles and Nigeria's challenges as well as Nigeria's promises, it is important to contextualize that in the work that the Department of Political Science, so eloquently indicated by Dr. Young, has mentioned. And if you look at some of the graduates from CAU, those graduates have come from the continent and have gone back to play leadership roles. So the department's conversation with you tonight in the sense of this seminar is really a continuation of a long-standing commitment to what we do in the academy and to encourage younger scholars that I see in the room, students, to take on that space and to continue to build those relationships that have been there for a long, long time. And your presence here, Ambassador, is a testament to that commitment, and I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank those of you who are here, faculty members, our students, and our staff who are here to engage in this and ask questions. They shouldn't really be focused on just Nigeria, but also the challenges across the continent. It's very sad this evening as I listened to the news that we also had another incident of and it's not been claimed, but there was an attack on a mosque in the country killing 50 people, innocent people, which simply gone to pray. And so the challenges we face are, so as we deal with safety issues, we also deal with those across. And so ask questions, engage. This is a meaningful conversation, and I thank you for putting this together. And thank you again for joining us at the university. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. All right, so what we'll do this evening is we will ask our guests to provide some thoughts and some words on the topic of contemporary economic and security challenges in Nigeria, issues and prospects. I'm going to call forward in a minute Dr. Chibo Eligwe, who will introduce the speaker, but I also want to take a moment to identify, in addition to Dr. Eligwe, one of our guests who is joining us for this semester, Dr. Godwin Ehemije, who is also from Nigeria, in addition to Dr. Eligwe. And I take a moment to recognize them because, again, I want to emphasize this tradition that we have in our department of a very strong relationship with Nigeria, with professors who come from the continent, who come from Nigeria, and students who come to us. Again, please look forward to raising questions and sharing in some dialogue so that this is indeed a conversation. I'm sure that there's a lot there for us to talk about. And so without further ado, Dr. Eligwe, could you come please and introduce our speaker?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to introduce our August visitor and speaker, guest speaker. This I'm happy to do. Our August visitor, Ambassador Kayode Laro, is accompanied by two other diplomats who are heads of department in various areas. They are Mr. Innocent Wejo and Mr. Shegun Olukomubon. His Excellency Kayode Laro is a Nigerian career diplomat. He graduated in 1980 with a degree in geography from Ahmed Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. He holds a master's degree in planning from United Nations Institute for Development and Planning in Dakar, Senegal. From 2008 to 2009, His Excellency Kayode Laro participated in several strategic level training programs of Nigeria's top military training institution, the National Defense College of Nigeria, which earned him the prestigious award of a Fellow of the college. Since 1983, His Excellency Laro has worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria and has also served in various capacities, both home and abroad. His most diplomatic postings and assignments were to Geneva, where he worked on human rights and disarmament, and New York, where he worked on United Nations Security Council matters. Prior to his arrival in Atlanta, Georgia, in February 2017, as Consul General, His Excellency Laro was the Director in the Office of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria. He is married with children, and his interests include golf, chess, military history, and aviation. With pleasure, I introduce to you our august visitor, our guest speaker, a complete gentleman, and very unassuming, His Excellency Kayode Laro, Consul General of Nigeria, Atlanta, Georgia, USA.
Faculty and students of Clark Atlanta University, Department of Political Science, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Department of Political Science of Clark Atlanta University for inviting me to this departmental seminar to speak on the contemporary economic and security challenges in my country, Nigeria. Let me start with a little bit of background. Nigeria has a population of around 180 million, and that is approximately 1/5 of the population of Africa. It is estimated that by the year 2050, the Nigerian population will reach 300 million, thus making Nigeria the third most populous country in the world. In terms of the economy, the World Bank ranked Nigeria as the 21st largest economy in the world in 2016, with a gross domestic product of $1.091 trillion US. This makes Nigeria the largest economy in Africa, with Egypt, South Africa, Algeria, and Morocco rounding off the top 5 economies on the continent. Now, I would like to talk about our economic challenges before going to the security challenges. Between 2006 and 2015, a period of 10 years, the Nigerian economy grew at an annual average rate of 6.3%, according to the World Bank. However, in 2016, the economy contracted by 1.5%, the first time we experienced negative growth in 2 decades. The downturn started in the first quarter of 2016 and continued through the first quarter of 2017. So that was 5 quarters in a row. Now, after 5 consecutive quarters of contraction, the economy grew by 0.55% in the second quarter of 2017, signaling an emergence from recession. I should note that one of the main causes of the recession was the collapse in oil prices on global markets from as high as $104 per barrel in February of 2014 to as low as $31 a barrel in February of 2016. That's a tremendous drop in prices over a span of 2 years. When we consider the fact that oil exports account for over 90% of Nigeria's foreign exchange earnings and 80% of the federal government's budgetary revenues, it is not hard to figure out how devastating the impact of a catastrophic drop in oil prices would be on the Nigerian economy. And this brings me to one of our most urgent challenges, which is the need to diversify our economy away from overdependence on oil. This is an important strategic goal for the federal government that is reflected in the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan 2017 to 2020, launched in April of this year. The plan aims to, among other things, boost agricultural output through the expansion of crop production, fisheries, and livestock. It also aims to promote industrialization through increased growth in the manufacturing sector and small and medium enterprises. The Economic Recovery and Growth Plan projects an average annual growth rate of 6.9% over the plan period, that is 2017 to 2020, for the agricultural sector and 8.5% for the manufacturing sector. The other economic challenge I want to talk about is the high interest rate charged by Nigerian commercial banks on loans. It is an established fact that the availability of cheap credit for investment can drive economic growth. Conversely, when credit is expensive, that is, when interest rates are high, there is a corresponding disincentive to invest in the kind of productive activity that could generate growth. It is not unusual to hear of commercial interest rates above 20% in the Nigerian financial sector. While this may sound outrageous to people accustomed to single-digit interest rates, as is generally the case here in the United States, it should be seen from the perspective of the rate of inflation. With inflation in the double digits around 16%, it may be understandable why commercial lending rates in Nigeria are high. For us to bring down interest rates, therefore, we must bring down inflation. Inflation, of course, is not a uniquely Nigerian problem. Every country at one time or the other has had to deal with it to varying degrees. For us in Nigeria, one of the main causes of inflation is high production costs linked to the high cost of raw materials, high energy costs, and inadequate infrastructure. The federal government, through the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, is taking measures to address the problem of inadequate electricity, which has left manufacturers and other economic operators dependent to a large extent on private power generation that runs mainly on diesel. The problem of inadequate infrastructure is also being addressed through massive investment in railways, roads, and ports. We are optimistic that when all these projects come to fruition, we will see a substantial reduction in production costs for manufacturers and other economic operators. With lower production costs, we expect a major cause of inflation to be eliminated. With inflation under control, we would be well on the way to reining in high interest rates. Now let me talk about our security challenges. I believe you are all aware of the Boko Haram insurgency that began in 2009 and destabilized northeastern Nigeria. Upon the assumption of office of President Muhammadu Buhari in 2015, the federal government gave top priority to the destruction of the Boko Haram terrorist group. We are pleased to say that Boko Haram, as of today, has been militarily defeated and does not control a square inch of Nigerian territory. We thank our friends in the international community, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, and many others, for their support in our fight against Boko Haram. We also acknowledge the important cooperation that we have received from our neighbors, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Benin, in our counterterrorism efforts. Despite our achievements against Boko Haram, challenges still remain, as we have seen in recent suicide bombings. And the provost mentioned the one that actually happened today in Nigeria. But we assure the international community of our firm determination to complete the restoration of peace and security to the northeast of our country. The other security challenge I want to mention is the call for secession in some parts of Nigeria. This is a security challenge of a political nature, which our political leaders at the federal and state levels are addressing. There is an underlying agreement among them that the unity of Nigeria is non-negotiable. It is a fact that the vast majority of Nigerians want to live together in peace and harmony. I thank you for your kind attention and will be pleased to answer your questions.
Okay, yes, Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Consul General. First of all, good evening, and welcome to Clark University. Thank you for your kind words. I wanted to ask you one question that I want my colleagues here to ask you as well. Nigeria is a member of both ECOWAS, which is the Economic Cooperative of Western African States, and the African Union. What are some of the economical and security challenges that you feel Nigeria's participation in ECOWAS better position you all to address than your participation in the African Union?
Well, as a matter of fact, the answer is both. Because ECOWAS, we in ECOWAS have a tremendous amount of experience in combating regional crises or regional security situations. I assume you're all aware of ECOMOG. That's what ECOWAS did in Liberia and Sierra Leone during the civil wars in those countries. And it was countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal that led that effort. And so if you recall back then, we did that, frankly, without a lot of international support. We had the political support of the UN at the level of the Security Council, but financially, we had to just bear the cost ourselves. So ECOWAS has a tremendous amount of experience in dealing with regional, security challenges. And of course, the headquarters of ECOWAS itself is in Abuja, Nigeria, and we have participated in all major operations in the sub-region. So, and again, if you look at the way ECOWAS has operated, I think ECOWAS could actually be held up as a model for regional cooperation on security issues across the continent, really. Because we were the first to, amongst the regional economic communities in Africa, to come up with a force like ECOMOG, which was fully funded by ECOWAS. And the achievements of ECOMOG are there for all to see in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We restored peace to those countries, and so there's a lot for us to learn from that. But then the AU also has a role to play. The reason being that if I should just talk about the security challenge created by the Boko Haram insurgency in particular, it was focused on the northeastern part of my country, and this is a vast territory, and that the northeast shares borders with Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon, and the point where the four countries meet is where you have the lake itself. That's Lake Chad. This was basically the theater of operations, for the counterterrorism efforts. So we had to work with Niger, Chad, and Cameroon in dealing with Boko Haram. Niger is a member of ECOWAS, but Chad and Cameroon are not. They're in ECAS, that's the Economic Community of Central African States. Nigeria is located, of course, where West Africa meets Central Africa. So we are constrained to cooperate with these countries, even though they're not in ECOWAS. But the interesting thing again is that all these countries I mentioned, Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger, belong to the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So that was also another avenue for us to cooperate on counterterrorism matters. And as part of the measures we adopted to deal with Boko Haram, because you will probably know that intelligence is key in dealing with terrorism and terrorists. Intelligence is key. And so we set up a regional intelligence fusion unit with the other countries, and they are not even in ECOWAS. So ECOWAS, we've kind of tried to adopt a flexible approach in dealing with this particular security challenge. It's not, the focus hasn't been too much on ECOWAS or AU, but on the 4 countries that are primarily affected, working together as members, because all these 4 countries I mentioned are members of the Lake Chad Basin Commission. So we have a bit of overlap. You have ECOWAS, of course, being interested in knowing in what's going on there. You have ECAS. As a matter of fact, there was a time ECAS, that's the East Economic Community of Central African States, and ECOWAS were to have a joint summit to discuss the Boko Haram issue, because they realized that 2 of the countries affected were in ECOWAS and 2 were in ECAS. We've had this sort of interaction, and of course the AU too came in, because when I was in New York, until early last year, the time I spent in New York was spent working on the Security Council, and it's the Security Council that's the main body of the UN concerned with global security issues. So the AU, had cause to sort of work together with the UN at the level of the Security Council on the Boko Haram challenge, and so the AU itself got involved. Because, of course, the AU, members, we're all members of the AU, just as our neighbors are. So there's been a great deal of overlap. So that's just, we take help from wherever we can get it, really. Yeah.
Please identify yourselves, please, as you ask the question.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. My name is Sanjay. I'm a graduate student at Atlanta University Department of Political Science. There was an interview with the President of Nigeria early this January, and he mentioned 3 issues related facing the Nigerian, and I quote, insecurity, poor economy, and corruption. Well, there can't be any other problem related to any country, but he related that. And I went back and I looked at these 3 elements in the last 7 years, and there's a positive correlation between Libyan Gaddafi in Libya and these 3 issues, which has been substantially increasing in the last 7 or 8 years. And then I looked at the role of Nigeria in Libya, and Nigeria government was the first government, one of the first government who recognized the Libyan Transition Council, or the Libyan anti-Gaddafi. And you just mentioned very proudly that you appreciate the role of foreign countries like England, France, and US in helping Nigeria in different areas. Was there any strategic mistake with the Nigerian government going after Gaddafi, hoping that Nigeria petrodollar will probably be the strongest in the continent of Africa?
No. I don't see it that way. No, I don't see it that way. The situation with Gaddafi was a matter the Security Council dealt with, and the Security Council passed a resolution, and as we all know, countries are bound by Security Council resolutions, So I really don't think, we certainly didn't have any particular interest pertaining to oil or anything like that, in the crisis. We didn't at all. We didn't. We have, we worked with other African countries within the context of the AU, on Libya, and whatever actions we took were in line with the consensus, in the AU. That's how it was.
Robert.
Good evening, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah, Nigeria, as you already mentioned, is not only an economic power. I believe that it's a political power in Africa as well. What is it doing with the crisis that we have in Africa now? In Cameroon, the Anglophones want to form their own country. In Togo, we have crisis, Central African Republic. What part is Nigeria playing to reduce or to face this crisis as an African political power?
Well, you know, one thing about crisis situations in countries is, more often than not, countries will themselves feel that they have the capacity to deal with them. You know, so unless and until they ask for help, you have to walk a fine line between trying to help and appearing as if you're interfering in their internal affairs. Now, if a crisis will have regional dimensions, that's if a crisis has a potential to spill over into neighboring countries, then our preference in Nigeria would be to see the regional economic community to which that country belongs dealing with it first. You know, so if it was something happening, for example, say, you mentioned Togo, we would not normally jump in, you know, unless we're invited, you know. The only thing that could bring us in is if a resolution is adopted at the level of ECOWAS, mandating a certain action to be taken. You know, so because there's a fine line between trying to, you certainly don't want to seem as if you're offering help when it's not been asked. You know, so these things countries are very sensitive about that. You know, and we've seen countries that have experienced even natural disasters saying we don't need help, we're fine. You know, so. Not to talk of countries maybe in some kind of political crisis or some security situation. Unless and until they ask us for help, we wouldn't be able to jump in.
Greetings and thank you for your comments, Ambassador. My name is Jared Grant. I'm a graduate student here, Park Atlanta, Political Science Department. I wanted to ask, Nigeria's human capital and intellectual capital is famous and great. But you mentioned growing your economy, and what are you doing more to invest back into that intellectual capital there in Nigeria to perhaps grow the economy based on some of the entrepreneurial efforts away from the oil relationships, away from dependency on maybe the World Bank, and growing your own stock exchange, which I think is at about 177 companies or so. What are the efforts being done to reinvest back into your own intellectual capital to invent and create as opposed to be dependent or have relationships that could lead to some dependence?
Well, the various actions the government is taking, really. A lot is being done to not only develop our human capital, but to sustain it as well. I remember back in the 70s, we only had maybe a handful of universities, you know, and they were all owned by the federal government, all of them, you know. But as we moved into the 80s, we saw state governments, because the structure of Nigeria is similar to the structure of the US, where you have a federal government and then the state governments, you know. So, so as we moved into the 80s, the state governments started, you know, establishing their own universities, and then into the 90s, the federal government started to issue licenses for private universities to be established. what we have now is a situation where some states have 3, 4, 5 universities. So there's been a tremendous effort, really, to establish tertiary institutions, universities especially, and not just general universities, but sometimes specialized universities. We have universities of agriculture, we have universities of technology, we have universities of education, and so on. So this has helped to build up a tremendous base of well-educated young people, and there's also been a great deal of creativity on the part of our youth. Young people these days are not content to just come out of university and start looking for work. Rather, they want to be entrepreneurs and employers of labor themselves. And the federal government is assisting with efforts through what we call the National Directorate of Employment, which encourages young people to sort of like reach deep into themselves and take advantage of the talents they have. So there's been that effort. It's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing thing. We have the same challenges that a lot of other countries have. In terms of youth unemployment and so on. But we know that the future really lies in training the youth to be able to be self-sufficient, to be able to employ themselves. We see what's going on in this country. What is happening in Silicon Valley and other parts of the US here. I mean, we see young people creating wealth, and we want to emulate that. Yeah.
Your Excellency, first of all, I want to use this opportunity to commend the citizens of Nigeria for the entrenchment of democracy in our country. So record that Nigeria has enjoyed almost 2 decades of uninterrupted civilian administration. Therefore, we can rightly assume that military dictatorship is no longer fashionable as an alternative form of government in our country. Time for that. The administration took over power from an incumbent government that had been in power for about 60 years, which was the first in our most recent history. We ran on the mantra, change, change, and change. We can say also that there's visible or level improvement in some sectors of the economy. Like you mentioned, power. I remember that when you started, power production was about 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts. And we're now close to 7,000 to 8,000 megawatts. We also saw improvement in transportation, road infrastructure, service delivery in terms of retail products, food products, and petroleum, and most importantly, corruption, especially the institution of the single treasury account. Nigerians are still complaining. So, what do you think that the administration is not doing right? Especially when we are approaching a period of change, possibly re-election of Buhari in 2018. Second question is about my students. We want to know whether the office has detached opportunities from economic development.
Right. Thank you so much. Well, it's interesting. We're a free society, really. Nigeria is just like the US in terms of the level of freedoms we have. So people are free to express themselves. There are people who will be pleased with the situation, and there are those who will not be pleased with the situation. But I think on balance, the government has done a fairly good job of setting things right in the country. Let me just give you an example. Before the current administration came to office, the exchange rate, the Naira-dollar exchange rate was just something else. I mean, a dollar exchange for more than 500 Naira and that had an impact on inflation because it affected import prices, and it had a tremendous impact also on the manufacturing sector, which depends to a large extent on imported raw materials. But now the dollar exchanges at just a little over 360 naira. That's a tremendous improvement, And I was reading the reports of some of the top companies on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, and they are all so pleased with the current situation because they're declaring huge profits, which wasn't something they could talk about a few years ago, So a lot needed to be fixed, and you know very well that the years preceding President Buhari's assumption of office were dominated by Boko Haram. That was just, it seemed that all the attention, all the focus of the government was just on Boko Haram, on fighting Boko Haram, So that really drew a bit of attention away from other sectors. And that was the reason why when President Buhari came to office, he set down Boko Haram, defeating Boko Haram as his top priority. Because unless and until he did that, he couldn't do anything else. So, and as I said, we've taken care of that tremendously. Boko Haram they don't hold a square inch of our territory anymore. And now we can begin to address other issues. That's not to say that these issues were not being addressed at all, before. They were being addressed. And again, people are free to express themselves. If they want to complain, they're free to complain. But because it's a free society, that. I think it's a question of expectations, really. A question of expectations. The government is doing a lot, but I think there's a feeling that, okay, maybe more could be done. And really, I think definitely the government would do more if it had more resources. Because don't forget that when President Buhari came to office, oil prices were at roughly maybe 30% of what they were even a year before. And that had a tremendous impact on the resources available to the government, which is why it's so urgent for us, to move our economy away from this overdependence on oil.
Anyway, along the faculty, some would say that when Nigeria sneezes, Africa catches a cold. Meaning, therefore, that the continent seems to, many of the states, to really rely on Nigeria for the way forward. Are there any part of the African Union? What other efforts is Nigeria making to lift Africa to the next level where it is anticipated to be?
Oh, well, it's lifting Africa to the next level, honestly, is something we all have to do together, frankly. There are 54 countries on the continent, and each and every one of them has a role to play in that, But we're happy to work within the context of the AU, because the AU has a lot going for it. It has a lot going for it. There's so many treaties, there's so many resolutions and protocols, within the context of the AU, But I think perhaps, you might say one of our greatest contributions to lifting Africa is what we have done, lifting our sub-region. Because you have to lift your sub-region before you talk about lifting anywhere else. You know, so, and we certainly can't talk about lifting Africa if our sub-region isn't really, you know, up and running. You know, so our focus has mainly been on ECOWAS, primarily on ECOWAS. You know, because the feeling is that it's the regional economic communities that form the building block for the continent. So if the regional economic communities like ECOWAS, like SADC, like ECAS, you know, like COMESA and so on, are strong, then the continent will be strong. You know, so, but again, we're happy to work with all countries across the continent, you know, to lift up the continent. It's not something we can do alone, definitely not.
Does Nigeria consider a military option of really occupying all the small states and making it bigger? Because sometimes other states have been born that way. So is Nigeria really considering that? Because we talk about African unity, sometimes drastic times call for drastic action.
The answer to that is no, because we don't have any territorial ambitions. We don't need a square inch of anybody's territory. We don't. We're fine with what we have, and we're happy with it. I mean, it's countries themselves have to decide how they want to run, basically. You know, so we are not going to. We don't have any territorial ambitions. We're not aiming to overrun any country militarily. We're not going to tell any country what to do. We're just happy to work with all countries across the continent in a partnership that is mutually beneficial and respectful.
Hi, my name is Marilyn Davis. I'm Chief Real Estate and Business Services Officer at Clark-Atlanta University. Welcome. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about Nigeria's relationship with Asia in general and China in particular. China has made, in the last decade or so, considerable inroads into Africa, particularly in helping build large infrastructure projects. Some would say that, or some do say that that's really with a view towards bringing out resources, natural resources to send to China, but with little concern about the development of the countries themselves. Is that a concern? Because I don't really know Nigeria's relationship with China, and if it is a concern, how does the country intend to contend with that?
Well, we will not judge the situation like that, frankly. We don't think China is coming to Nigeria to plunder our resources. We certainly don't think that. We believe that the relationship we have with China is a strategic partnership that is mutually beneficial. The most populous country in the world dealing with the most populous country in Africa. You know, the Chinese see they see a potential in us strengthening this relationship, and we ourselves see China as an avenue for us to more or less, diversify our international contacts in terms of getting assistance and so on. We have a need to develop, and as you probably know, I think China, they have maybe over $1 trillion in foreign reserves, so and they're happy to give us loans for huge infrastructure projects, which you can certainly finance at commercial rates, So we have this this deep cooperation with China in a strategic partnership. And of course, don't forget that China is also a permanent member of the Security Council. So, we aspire to become a permanent member of the Council too. And you can't get there unless you have, really, really good relations with all permanent members of the Council. So we see our relations with China not in terms of China coming in to exploit us. Certainly not. We see it as something mutually beneficial. Yeah.
Going back on the side, Timothy.
Welcome, Parkland, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Timothy Williams. I'm a graduate student here in political science. Recently, I did a paper on AFRICON. I don't know if you're familiar with this U.S. military operation that's stationed in Africa. It started under Bush and continued under Obama. I wanted to know what would be Trump's, position with that dealing with Africa and particularly Nigeria.
I can't say for certain because I really don't think there has been any pronouncement from the State Department on that, or even the White House. I'm not aware. But I do know that President Trump is open to establishing or to having good relations with my country. He met my president on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. That was in September. And we've had long-standing relations with the US, and we believe that it is in both countries' interests. It's in the interests of my country and this country to maintain and indeed strengthen those relations. So we don't expect anything to change under this administration because the fundamentals are there, they remain what they are, and if anything, perhaps we even have a more compelling need to strengthen the relations. So we don't think we don't think there'll be any downturn or anything in our relations with the U.S.
So to continue on that, what were the fundamentals of the relationship if under Obama or Bush or under Trump? Would it be a positive correlation or would it be a negative correlation?
I think it'll be positive. Yeah, because
based on what?
Based on the fact that we have, for example, a Nigeria-U.S. binational commission, okay, and the commission meets annually. Okay, the commission meets annually, and as a matter of fact, as I speak, I think they're actually having a meeting in Abuja right now. They meet annually to discuss a broad range of issues, of mutual interest to both sides. So we hold that very dear, and we're using that as a platform, just as the U.S. is using it as a platform, to strengthen cooperation between the two of us. And as I said in my presentation, we've received a tremendous amount of support from the U.S. in our counterterrorism efforts. So the U.S. has been a friend and remains a friend, and we don't expect anything to change.
So no neo-colonialism will come from...
I'm sorry?
Timothy, if we move on to the next question,
Thank you very much. I'm Golden Imager, Science Faculty. I believe charity begins at home. And over the years, we have seen Nigeria playing the deeper role in Africa. I think if Nigeria is going to continue to enjoy that pivotal role, there are certain things that Nigeria should do which are going to bring your attention to. Those three issues are very important. One is the issue of looted funds. We've heard so much about how past administration, some ministers stole money. For instance, just Maduka stole over, from the report I gathered, about $1.4 billion, just an individual. I want to know what the government is doing. And the second one is the issue of high rate of unemployment. And the third is the Fulani herdsmen. I don't know what the government is doing, so we want to know.
Right. On looted funds, we've received a lot of support from the countries in cases where we've been able to identify the looted funds. You know, we've received a lot of support from the countries concerned. You know, but what usually happens with looted funds is that in trying to extricate them and repatriate them, you sometimes run into a legal wall. You know, there's just litigation all over. You know, so the government is you know, constantly trying to fine-tune its strategy for getting these funds. But the best way, of course, is to go on a government-to-government basis. That's for our government to deal with other governments, and that's what we've been doing. You know, so we've made some. There's been, you know, some achievement in that respect. We've been able to recover some looted funds. You know, it's an ongoing thing, though. It's an ongoing thing, though, because you can only act when you identify the funds. You can only act when you identify the funds. And don't forget, the secrecy in banks, you know, the secrecy in banks and all that can be an obstacle sometimes. You know, so, and that's why even the Swiss authorities are, I think they're beginning to look into banking secrecy laws and all that, you know, because that has been a cover for people to loot funds and, you know, and deposit in some countries, you know. So it's an ongoing thing. It's I don't even think it's a problem that we are dealing with alone. You know, it's not something that we are dealing with alone. There might be other countries too dealing with such a problem, you know. But we are working with friendly governments. We are working with friendly governments to identify looted funds and repatriate them. High rate of unemployment. Well, the government is what the government is doing, and I said this earlier a short while ago, is to encourage young people to become entrepreneurs. You know, so we have the National Directorate for Employment, you know, that trains young people, you know, in various areas. We have, for example, the Bank of Industry that can provide funding for entrepreneurs, you know, and some other institutions. We have the Bank of Agriculture, you know, for people wishing to go into farming, and the federal government has, you know, these institutions, these mechanisms, these institutions in place, you know, to help fight unemployment. The problem, of course, is that we have, out of 180 million, we have probably, a huge chunk of that is made up of young people, you know. And when you talk about unemployment, the one that concerns the government the most is youth unemployment, you know. And it's another reason why it's one of the main, you know, aims of the economic recovery and growth plan, that to create jobs, you must grow the economy. You see, to create jobs, only a growing economy can absorb workers. We see it happen everywhere. You know, when the economy expands, employment picks up. When it retracts or when it shrinks, you have people ending up in the labor market. You know, so we are optimistic that if all goes well, and we certainly are working towards making sure that it goes well with our economic recovery and growth plan. The success of the plan will help us to tackle the issue of unemployment. You talked about herdsmen. Yeah, that's just you can, I think, attribute that to a fight over resources, basically. Yeah, and when you dig deep into clashes, in Nigeria, they are more often than not linked to land, more often than not. So, but then when there's a thin line between herdsmen trying to looking for pasture for their cattle, and the kind of banditry that we see some of them committing, So there's a thin line between that. It's the term herdsmen has become sort of like almost like a generic term. Something happens there, it's herdsmen. It may not necessarily be the case, actually. And I think there's some evidence that some of them may not even be Nigerians. So we have a long border, in the north. So it's just like the Boko Haram thing. Many of the fighters are not Nigerians. They're not. So that is an ongoing challenge, but it's been dealt with by the government, not just the federal government alone. The federal government has been working with the state governments and the local governments and communities, to ensure their safety. And of course, in any situation like this, intelligence is the key thing. Intelligence is the key thing. And the government, I know for a fact that the government has put out more human resources in terms of troops on the ground in the flashpoints, the areas that are identified as flashpoints, to pacify these areas. So it's linked to resources, but then again the government is dealing with it as banditry. Yes, and really working with the state governments, the communities, and the local governments. I think with the strategy the government is adopting now, it's something we're going to tackle.
Yes, sir. My name is Shola, Laro Shola. Of course, I should say I'm not a member of the faculty. I'm a student. I work for the government. I believe I came here in 1987, and this campus has changed tremendously. I found political science man, tremendous job. Your Excellency, how can we feed 180 million people in cultural samples? Impossible. So, you have mentioned that young people want to grow, become. Why is it that Nigeria does not have energy? It's beyond me. If you go anywhere, you just want to be a barber, be the best barber you can be, but no energy. If you want to be somebody who wants to preserve all those fruits, be the best you can be, no energy. Now, I'm glad to see all this young people. Suppose they are manufacturing something in Nigeria that they want to import to the US. With that quality product over there, it's never going to get to the US. My sister up there mentioned China. Nigeria is a dumping ground for China products. So my question has always been that all this information that the people collect from foreign countries, how does it get translated to the Nigerian government so that they can even use it to help? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The energy situation is critical. It's really it's a major challenge, frankly. And the reason is because for many, many years, there was no investment in the energy sector. There was none. You know, and the thing about the energy sector is that, you know, an investment in, say, a generating plant. A plant is not something you can order from Walmart or Amazon, you know. It has to be built, and it takes time to build it. You know, so for many years, there was little or no investment in the energy sector, you know, and we're paying for that now, frankly, you know, or I should say we've been paying for that for some time now, you know, because it's a bit of an irony that a country that exports oil and has so much gas, you know, lacks energy, you know, but when you look at the energy mix of the country, you know, we have the hydro power plants. We have the gas plants, mainly hydro and gas, you know. Now, what happens with the hydro is that the topography of the country can only support the construction of hydro plants in the north. Because to dam a river, you need a gorge. You know, you build a dam across a gorge. You know, in the south, where you have, now unfortunately again, when you look at the climate, the north that has the topography to support the construction of dams doesn't have the rainfall to, you know, that can actually fill a lake behind a dam to spin generators inside the dam. You know, so in the north, where you have the dams, all the hydro dams in Nigeria in the north, the one in Jeba, the one in Shiroro, the one in Kainji, you know, they're all in the north. Now, in the north, at best, you could have maybe 5 months of rainfall in a year, 4 or 5 months. In the extreme north, it drops to maybe about 2 or 3, you know. Whereas in the south, where you could have 10 months of rainfall in a year, the topography is flat and you can't build dams. You know, so that's a challenge for, one challenge for our energy sector. Because in the dry season, when the water level falls behind the dams, the generators can't really work optimally, you know. So that's that. Now, coming down south, where you have the gas, and I think all of our gas-fired generating stations are in the south. The problem with that again is that the gas has to be piped. The gas has to be piped to where the plants are, you know, and we've had problems with vandalism, you know, and all that, affecting these pipes. The gas is produced by the Nigerian Gas Company, which is the subsidiary of NNPC. So they have their own working methods and so on. The power plants are owned by different companies. You know, so sometimes you might have some issues with coordination, you know, in gas supply. You know, so we have all these issues. I mean, we've had plants that have been built and put in place for a number of years, but for some reason there'll be issues with getting gas to them. You know, and you know, it sounds really, but what the government has done is to split up the electricity company of Nigeria, you know. So you now have generating plant companies, distribution companies, transmission company, and distribution companies. And you know, it's our hope that that would improve the situation. But the economics of energy economics is also creating a problem here, because the generating companies sell to the transmission company. The transmission company moves the power and hands it to the distribution companies. So the generating companies, there's an issue with the pricing. You know, so there are just all this multiplicity of issues, which which the government is striving to resolve, because for the generating companies and the distribution companies, they'll want to sell at a certain rate that guarantees them a profit, which is understandable. But then the government also has to think about the social dimensions of this. The government doesn't want energy to be too expensive for the people to afford. So there are all these dimensions. Energy economics, inadequate infrastructure. Some of the transmission lines have been in place for decades, and they've not been upgraded. So that's why I said the neglect of the past is catching up with us, basically. For a long time, there was no investment in the energy sector, and we're seeing the result of that now. But even then, there are tremendous efforts going on right now within the framework of the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, to fast track the development of the energy sector, really. Because we know that without energy, really, and again, this is one of the reasons why, and I did mention it in my brief presentation, that high energy costs add to the cost of production, and that also feeds into inflation. And when inflation is high, interest rates are high. And if you don't get inflation down, interest rates won't come down. So it's all these multiplicity of issues, but we're dealing with them simultaneously, because that's what we need to do.
All right, we have time for maybe 2 more questions, so please keep your questions brief. Let's go to Hakeem, then the gentleman in front.
My name is Hakeem Adams. I'm a government resident here. I want to ask you a question as a member of the diplomatic corps. You talk about the challenges Nigeria being faced, and you know the U.S. What effort are you doing to mobilize diaspora resources? It's on record you have about over 30,000 medical doctors in the U.S., Nigerian doctors in the U.S. We have those in technical area, in other areas. And you're talking of challenges in Nigeria. So what is your role as a member of the diplomatic corps to mobilize these resources for use in Nigeria?
Thank you. The interesting thing is this. The government doesn't really need to mobilize, because our citizens abroad are themselves mobilizing, frankly. I didn't have a lot of contact with the Nigerian diaspora until I came to Atlanta, because most of my work has been in the UN. But when I got here and I saw what our citizens here are doing, to support development at home, without even the government prompting them, then it dawned on me that we have a pool of human capital, human resources, that can be tapped. And the government engages. We engage as a consulate with our diaspora here, with Nigerians living here in the U.S. We engage with them. Back home, the government also does that. But of course, what we can do is encourage. What we can do is encourage our people to go back home and see what they can contribute, to the development effort. And when they come to us to ask questions or seek support, we give them all the support we can. As a matter of fact, I think there's the Nigerians in Diaspora organization. We opened the consulate to them to hold their monthly meetings, as a way of supporting them, And you have Nigerians organized along professional lines, along various other lines of interest groups and so on, and we've seen what they do in terms of contributing to development back home.
Our last question.
My name is Kayode. I'm the guest of Dr. Lagos. Your Excellency, my question is, in 1961, President Kennedy signed an executive order implementing the affirmative action in the United States to address the disparities that were brought about by racism and racial policies in the country. What is the basis and justification for the Nigerian government to practice quota system in Nigeria, where the Northerners are given considerations for lower standard than citizens from the South?
You know, I don't think it's really a matter of lower standards as such. You know,
I can give you direct examples.
it's the thing is this. Nigeria is a federation of states, okay? As long as you are operating within the context of a federal institution or federal agency or anything that the federal government has set up, the aim of this quota system is to give every part of the country a sense of belonging. That's the aim. Okay, so it's also what I think affirmative action is all about. You know, that's part of it. You know, to give everybody access. You know, to give everybody access. You know, it's just it's a federal system. You know, made up of states. Whatever the government puts up, it puts up and runs on behalf of the country, you know, and every single state in the country has a stake in it, you know. So, you know, there's been a need for the government to come up with a way to ensure that every single state in the country is able to participate, you know. So that's really what it is. It's not really meant. It's not aimed at causing any group or groups to have an advantage or disadvantage. You know, it's just aimed at giving everybody a sense of being a part of it, a sense of belonging.
So just a follow-up, and I understand your position as a diplomat. You have to defend the policies of the government. But I'm one of those Nigerians that actually left the United States and went to Nigeria. I lived for 6 years in Nigeria and worked with the government. And I saw the impact, the direct negative impact of this quota system. Where, for instance, in the unity system for the school universities, federal universities, in the south, the minimum cutoff point is about 139, and in the north, it's only 9 or 10. And these students are being funded by the same resources from the federal government. And the irony of that is that it impacts the products at the end point. Because if you look in diaspora, when you look at the ratio and the disparities of Nigerians from the south and Nigerians from the north, it's a direct reflection of that fundamental basic inequalities that starts from Nigeria. So there's no justification. If you want to, and that's why I gave you the back information that I gave you. The affirmative action was brought about to address the racial injustice and inequalities in the policies.
Can you conclude?
Yes. So I don't. There's no injustice there, and the Northerners actually have held the power for the past 35 years. They've had the power in the country. So the best way to do that is to take a test, like everybody here. And the system is promoting mediocrity rather than excellence. So I think we need to look into that. It's affecting the country negatively.
Well, I don't think the facts back up what you're saying in terms of promoting mediocrity. I certainly disagree with you on that. I mean, you're entitled to your views, and I respect that. Yeah. But what we see, the results we see, do not support that. The government is responsible to all citizens across the country, and everybody must have a sense of belonging in the country, and whatever needs to be done to give them a sense of belonging will be done, and that's the position of the government. We can't adopt a zero-sum game, and because that would it's the outcome of the kind of position you're suggesting, could be far worse than what you think is a problem right now. everybody, every group in the country, regardless of where they are, must have a sense of belonging in the country. Everybody has a stake in the country, and everybody must have, their own space. They must have their own space. Yeah. So it is. Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't address the question of internship by students in the consulate. The work of the consulate, my own experience really, since I joined the service, the foreign service, is that interns, and the interns that I've seen work in wherever I was at our missions to the United Nations. So those are the places you can actually talk about internship. Because like in New York, I was in Geneva, we had interns. I was in New York, we had interns. But the work of the consulate doesn't quite support internship, really. It doesn't quite support internship. In the UN, you could be, sent to cover a meeting and draft a resolution and do things, that are related to what you've learned in college. The work of the consulate is a bit more specialized, and we deal more with, consular issues, economic issues, trade issues, and so on. And frankly, it hasn't been the practice in the Nigerian Foreign Service to engage interns in the consulates. It has been more of a practice at the UN missions, in Geneva and New York. So anyone interested in an internship, I think should reach out to the Permanent Mission of Nigeria, to the UN in New York.
Thank you again, Consul General Laro. I also want to take a quick moment to say thank you to Dr. Wilson to be able to put aside an hour and a half of your time. We really appreciate it. And also, thank you to the guests, faculty members, and students who are from other departments. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us. And we also I appreciate the question and the response with regard to opportunities for our students. But one of the traditions of the department has been, again, this long line of students from Nigeria who come to study with us. And certainly we look forward to having some more conversation about, in a sense, reigniting that pipeline, so to speak. All right, thanks again.